Thank you all for joining, and welcome to this month's gathering of the Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. My name is Jim Scott, and I'm president of Applied Policy based in Alexandria, Virginia. At Applied Policy, we help healthcare providers and other organizations navigate the world of federal healthcare policy. We're pleased to host these monthly gatherings to promote an exchange of ideas and approaches to multiple issues that define healthcare today. Today, we have a very esteemed panel joining us to discuss the current status of the Cancer Moonshot initiative. President Biden nurtured this effort as vice president. It was designed to accelerate research in cancer prevention, diagnosis, and treatment with the aim of making 10 years worth of progress in just 5 years. So what is the current status of this effort? And with the Biden administration now steering cancer research efforts, what potential breakthroughs might we expect in the near future? Joining me today are Karen E. Knudsen, MBA, PhD, who at the beginning of June took the helm at the American Cancer Society and its advocacy affiliate, the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, as Chief Executive Officer. Dr. Ned Sharpless, who's the 15th Director of the National Cancer Institute, having joined the Institute in 2017. And Ted Okon, who is Executive Director of the Community Oncology Alliance. I've asked our panelists to provide an opening statement, and following that, I'll lead a discussion with our three guests. And for you, the audience, please chat the questions to me or to everyone, and I'll work them into the conversation as I can. And I know we have a hard stop at 1:30, so we'll wrap up by then. So now let's start our discussion with Dr. Knudsen.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Karen Knudsen. I came to ACS 29 days ago as the CEO of ACS and ACS CAN, but with a deep appreciation for this organization. So I am an oncology researcher by trade and also a healthcare executive, having come to ACS and leaving the helm of one of the nation's leading cancer centers, one of the NCI designated cancer centers. ACS has a really unique function in the cancer continuum through our ability to improve the lives of cancer patients and their families based on a combination of advocacy, oncology research, both research we conduct as well as research that we fund throughout the nation, as well as direct patient support, things that we know close the gap in cancer care, things like navigation, transportation, and lodging for patients, as well as, of course, helping to shape the nation's cancer screening guidelines. So very happy to be here with the panel to talk about where we've been in the Moonshot and where I think we're going from an oncology perspective.
Thank you. And Dr. Sharpless.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to come and speak today. And I apologize for the AV challenges at the beginning here. We're just past sort of the halfway point of the Cancer Moonshot, so it's really a good time to assess the progress. I think as many of you are aware, this was sort of started in 2017, and we've had 5 years of funding. It's intended to go for 7 years total. So, it's a good period to assess what the Moonshot has done and is doing and will continue to do. It's also, I think, a really important time in cancer research where it's sort of the 50th anniversary of the National Cancer Act, which was signed in 1971 by President Nixon to give it really sort of galvanize the cancer research community and invigorate the cancer research effort nationally. And that is, I think we've had a lot of success over the last five decades, but we still have a lot of progress to make. And so that's why the Moonshot was a fitting initiative at the time. I think we will come back to look at the present time of cancer research as really a golden age of cancer research. We have all this progress and prevention and screening and new therapeutics and really a new armamentarium and new ways of treating cancer and a new molecular understanding of cancer. So I think the Moonshot really happened at a fortuitous time for cancer research. The discussing what the Moonshot does is just too big for a short session. It's 240 new initiatives, 70 programs. It's a $1.8 billion of funding, of which more than $1 billion has already been dispersed. So if you're interested in the many, many things the Moonshot has taken on, I commend a recent publication for myself, Dina Singer and Cancer Cell about a month ago on what the Moonshot's been doing specifically in a bunch of areas. But Suffice it to say, the whole process was guided by a panel of blue ribbon advisors who then identified high priority themes with really the goal of accelerating ideas that were almost ready for clinical usage into clinical care in a variety of areas, including clinical trials and population sciences and survivorship, et cetera. There have been, lastly, I'll say there are really 4 essential themes throughout all of the Moonshot initiatives, and that's a real commitment to collaboration, a very robust and strong embrace of open access publications, so the dissemination of research data generated by the Moonshot in a very timely way, a very robust and forceful policy regarding data sharing, making these data publicly available that the Moonshot is generating, and then an intense focus on the elimination of cancer health disparities. So the advances that we make within the Moonshot will be disseminated to all populations regardless of wealth and access. So those are really sort of the underlying themes of the Moonshot that really underpin all of its work. So I'd be happy to talk in more detail about specific projects, but suffice it to say, we're more than midway point, and I think it's off to a terrific and exciting start.
Thank you very much. And Ted?
Thanks, Jim. I'm honored to be on the panel. I am Ted O'Con, the Executive Director of the Community Oncology Alliance. We're a nonprofit organization representing community practices, which range in over 500 oncologists down to 1 or 2, and community oncology, where 55% of the cancer care in this country is delivered. I underscore what Dr. Sharpless said in terms of this kind of being a golden age. I think when you think of new therapeutics, new diagnostic tools, biomarkers, and you basically see that we are making so much progress. I think that's the good news. I think on the bad news side is the fact that what has been glaring during the pandemic, which I think has been sort of an asteroid shot to the side of the moonshot, if you will, because of and I can talk about that more in terms of the shortfalls in screenings, and we're seeing patients come in with more advanced cancers. It certainly had a decided impact on clinical research and all of that. But I think what we also see during this, and our eyes have been opened up to the issue of health disparities in cancer, both from the diagnostic side all the way to the treatment side. And health disparities is nothing new. We're making a big deal of it now because of a number of issues that have surfaced during the pandemic. But this is not a 1-year, 5-year, it's not even a 50-year problem. And I think that's sort of on the negative side of it. I think the other thing is with all the advancements we made in diagnosis and treatment, and really it is being a golden age, and look at new therapeutics, IO agents, and cellular therapies. We also have a big problem of how do we pay for this? And that's a real problem as well too, because we have this sort of Rube Goldberg healthcare system in this country, where a lot of people actually profit off of cancer and cancer drugs and whatnot. So good news, bad news. Certainly COVID has been a major interrupter, and I'll hand it back to you, Jim.
Thanks, Ted. We'll drill down into that in just a little bit, but let's go back to Dr. Knudsen. First of all, what is ARPA-H? I've seen the acronym, and then if it turns out the president can secure the requested funds to create that, how would you suggest that the administration prioritize that funding if ARPA-H came into fruition?
Right. So ARPA-H, I think it's important to note, goes beyond, well beyond anything associated with cancer research. Well, that's a component. It's certainly not the entire intent of ARPA-H. I think, the concept there for ARPA-H, as my understanding is that the portfolio of projects would really fall into 2 general categories. One is transformational basic science or platform development initiatives that have an opportunity to catalyze other research. So, for example, things like the Human Genome Project. So that's a perfect concept here. So once we had the human genome unlocked, there was this tremendous potential to unlock a subsequent amount of research. And oncology research was one of the things that was propelled forward. This gave us an opportunity to look into our genetic makeup, but also into the process of executing the project, in developing sequencing technology. So looking for similar types of big ideas, knowledge and tools. But why this construct? And I think that's something interesting to discuss. It's my understanding that the kinds of projects that get taken up are the work that would be impactful for patients, but may not be being done at this moment due to a lack of a commercial model. So we tend to think of the NIH as a research ecosystem for funding that foundational discovery that can be translated ultimately, and industry essentially taking that partnership forward. So ARPA-H can really step in cases where the science is really ripe, but the financial incentives may not be lacking, or the financial resources may not be quite there. So creating the kinds of partnerships that perhaps couldn't happen under a more traditional model. But from the ACS perspective, I think what's really important to note is we very much hope that this is a net gain for the oncology discovery mission, that this is, in no way taking away from the National Cancer Institute and our ability to generate those foundational discoveries that help patients and that are informed by the clinic, but are a both and an add-on to what it is that we're able to do toward the goal of accelerating discovery.
Thank you, Dr. Knudsen. And then Dr. Sharpless, is there anything you could add about ARPA-H? And then also if you could go on to highlight a few of the key projects started by the Moonshot to drill down a little bit there, please.
Sure. President Biden campaigned on ARPA-H. He mentioned it on the campaign trail. It's a top domestic priority for the president. So far, what we know about it is what's in the president's budget, which is very short. It has sort of 30 lines of text about the capabilities and authorities of ARPA-H. And then there's a published report from Francis Collins and Eric Lander and others on ARPA-H in Science this week. And those of you who are interested in that topic, I would recommend you look at that. It's modeled after DARPA, which has a really successful track record of taking on the kind of science that's deliverable focused, engineering projects that require a specific task or capability be met. And, that has been very successful, DARPA developing projects for their client, the DoD. ARPA-H, I think, is envisioned to be similar in terms of how it's managed, how the money's handled, how the projects are managed, the fail fast and decrease or terminate projects that fail early when they aren't meeting their milestones. So that would be a different way of thinking from the traditional, say, the NCI paradigm of giving money to basic scientists and letting them work on investigator-initiated science. So this would be more top-down driven science. And I think, as Karen mentioned, we totally believe there are projects and goals in cancer where ARPA-H might, the capabilities of something like ARPA-H might be very, very useful for certain kinds of cancer discovery. But also we are very concerned about, maintaining what we're doing well, which is, funding the foundational basic science that has, led to this golden age of cancer research. I mean, all of these great ideas that are making it into patients today were, an NCI funded grant 10 or 15 years ago that, created the basic science upon which these structures are built. And we still need some new ideas in cancer. I think we still need to commit to that kind of basic science as well. In terms of projects started by the Moonshot, I could mention a couple and give you a flavor of what it's done. As I said, it's 240 projects, so it's a lot to talk about. But at one end, we have a sort of basic science to translational initiative like the Human Tumor Atlas Network, which is a big data initiative to generate very intricate atlases of cancers as they develop. So starting at very early stage to metastatic disease and different tumor types and different populations of patients, and really then generating just massive amounts of genomic and RNA and protein and clinical data, and putting all of that data in the public domain as accessible through our web portal across multiple different tumor sites. And then once that data exists, the research community is very clever, and they go in and use those data for purposes that we never really envisioned. Karen mentioned the success of the Cancer Genome Atlas and the Human Genome Atlas. Those projects, were similar. The Human Tumor Atlas is now a new effort to really get longitudinal collection of data about tumors and their associated milieu with time, and we think will be very useful. At the other end of the spectrum is an initiative like the Cancer Center Cessation Initiative, or the C3I, which is a Moonshot-supported project to really try and bolster tobacco cessation at NCI-designated cancer centers. So we found that there are many patients who are actively smoking, who are going into cancer centers, often for treatment of smoking-related malignancies. and they hadn't really been offered smoking cessation counseling. And smoking cessation is now quite successful, and there are multiple FDA-approved products or FDA-cleared products for this. And so we were concerned that this wasn't being offered to all patients who were coming into cancer centers who were appropriate for such cessation services. And so through a Moonshot-backed supplement program, we now fund cessation services at more than 50 NCI-designated cancer centers. Each cancer center kind of comes up with its own program tailored for its own patients. And this is a real deliverable good for patient care at those centers, and also advances a top priority of the NCI, which is advancing tobacco control research. So, that gives you a flavor of the two extremes. And then there's kind of everything in between of clinical trials and CAR T cells and novel therapeutics and population sciences and a whole bunch of stuff.
Exciting stuff. And Ted, the basic research, science, and discovery is all very important, but from a boots on the ground perspective, what are some of the practical impediments that hinder advancement of cancer diagnosis and treatment?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Number one, obviously, on a big global scale, Jim, COVID-19 has had a profound impact that we really don't know ultimately what the impact will do. I think early on, Dr. Sharpless had put out something in terms of some of the impact. I was a co-author on a study looking at the shortfalls in cancer screenings. And if you talk to oncologists now, we had an all-day board meeting. So I had about 30 oncologists in a room for most of last Tuesday. And they will tell you sort of anecdotally that patients are coming in with more advanced cancers. And that's a profound impact, both in terms of obviously, number one, on the individual and their quality of life and their life expectancy. But number two, on the system in terms of it costs more to treat, stage 4 metastatic breast cancer patient than someone at stage 2 or 3, obviously. So from a big perspective, Jim, I mean, COVID has had an impact that we don't know what that will be, especially in terms of mortality, morbidity. We won't know that for a while, but we are looking at that very closely. And we're actually even looking at putting a microscope to breast cancer and looking at breast cancer screening pre-COVID along racial, ethnic, socioeconomic lines, and then during COVID as well too. But I think one of the disconnects that we see here in terms of all the advancements that are made in diagnosis and treatment at sort of a high level, when you get down to boots in the ground, we see things like the impact of a consolidated insurance and PBM industries together are having a profound impact on patients actually getting diagnosed and getting treatment. I mean, if it's rare when a day goes by that I don't hear from someone about a cancer patient not being able to get the drugs that they should be getting, having to fail first and violently throw up before they get the antiemetic that would stop that. Drugs where basically have to be delivered by some PBM mail order pharmacy and they don't get there. So I see more impediments to this, and we even see the PBM type industry showing up on the lab side of it as well too, which will obviously affect the diagnosis. So there's so many advancements that are being made. We have so much to be optimistic about. I don't mean to be a downer in terms of COVID. We just have to be realistic about it. But just on an ongoing basis, we have to realize that there are middlemen that are influencing more, coming between the patient and their physician in terms of getting the optimal treatment that they should be getting, and not because you're having someone manage the cost, but because somebody is profiting more on the decisions that they are making in terms of getting in between the patient and the physician.
Dr. Knudsen, is the American Cancer Society seeing an impact of COVID-19 on screening, diagnosis, and treatment of cancer?
Yeah, so I also want to say I very much agree with Ted. There's so much more that we have to do in order to achieve cancer care equity. And there's a lot to unpack there. So I want to answer your question though, Jim, from the lens of having just stepped away from leading a large 2-state cancer center. There's quite a lot that we're still trying to rebound from when it comes to COVID. I don't think any of the centers have seen a true recovery despite best efforts in education, in trying to make public proclamations about the importance of screening. We've not recovered. So that significant fall off that we saw in 2020 of patients coming in for routine screening is something we still very much need to work toward as a nation. But if you even look pre-COVID, we had a lot of work to do. There was an ACS study in 2019 coming out looking at compliance rates overall for cancer screening. And although some awareness has made an impact, colorectal cancer screening pre-COVID had started to rise nationally. The screening rates for cervical cancer have steadily declined since 2005. Breast cancer screening rates, to Ted's point about the concerted effort, have remained relatively stable at a low number. And the number of patients who are compliant or uptaking lung cancer screening is barely measurable. So things that we can do through policy, through research to understand barriers to screening, which is in part funded by the NCI, are really, and in part funded by ACS, are really important. But it's also the case that there are things that I think we can advocate for just within the cancer care or within the healthcare community itself. So we know that patients who had a visit to a primary care physician pre-COVID had twice the odds of having undergone, for example, colorectal cancer screening, and a 30% greater chance of going for follow-up. So I think there are a number of touch points that we can utilize to try to catch cancer early, to Ted's point, where we have a greater chance to treat that patient successfully, improve their quality of life, and avoid the development of advanced disease. I think that's something that I hope that this entire group can circle around and think through.
Thanks. And one of our applied policy team members that's headquartered in Switzerland just raised her hand. So Kate, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Jim. I have the honor of working for Jim Scott, who I knew at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and also at Roche. I just wondered what the speakers thought about artificial intelligence, particularly in pathology, for speeding, up diagnoses and allowing physicians to, perhaps make a decision earlier and or have a quality control mechanism for determining, pathology later on, if that's clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. So let's go to Dr. Sharpless. Any
Sure.
thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating topic. First, I should plug a I published a paper on this topic like yesterday or something. So Tony Karlovich and I just wrote a review in BBA on artificial intelligence and cancer care that came out, within the last like 48 hours. So it's fresh top of mind. I can also say that, having been an acting FDA commissioner, I saw how the Medical Device Center there is thinking about AI-enabled tests, and it's a really fascinating topic. Suffice to say, I think there are probably about 70 on that, or 70 to 100 FDA cleared assays that are being used for clinical care that are AI enabled today, right? So AI is not like the future. It's not coming down the pike. It's here. It's now. Most of those assays are radiology image analysis, although not all. They're echocardiograms, and they're probably a pathology tool in there too. Generally, the intent is to accelerate or to speed, clinical utility, so that the pathologist or the radiologist can read a slide or an image in a shorter amount of time, but still a human is intended to sign off on these tests. Obviously, this provides some significant research challenges. Who's going to make, most of the AI-enabled tests on chest CTs use the NCI NLST database that we've made publicly available. So we have a good image database for chest CTs, but where are the image databases for MRIs and PET scans and all that kind of stuff you need? So having the right data to train on is a really crucial research issue. Having the clinical annotation to go with those scans and images is a crucial research issue. Putting all of this in the cloud somewhere in a way that's safe and privacy preserving and de-identified and you can afford are all big issues. And then when you have these devices cleared and they go out in the wild and they continue to learn and adapt on new material, you have the potential for overtraining and decreased performance. And that's a really interesting and important issue. So all of these things are, critical to how we think about AI, but it is really here, both for clinical usage and clinical care. It's also become a really, really important part of cancer research. So AI-enabled tools are helping scientists analyze very large data sets in a streamlined way and estimate multi-parameter systems that have very large search spaces that are not tractable through other methods. So it's really an important research tool and an important clinical care tool. And I think we're going to be seeing just myriad applications that we can't even conceive of today. Suffice it to say, the NCI has to support this kind of research and the FDA has to regulate it, but I think we're on the case.
Oh, thank you very much. I was also referring to also some of the newer methods, such as, looking at slides, and where a pathologist doesn't have to start counting cells or malignancies and can get from the cloud a reading of whether this is malignant or not. I think outside of radiology, at least what I have been seeing, there is a lot of promise.
I agree. I think pathology is, as I said, I suspect some of those 70 tools, a few of them are pathology applications as well, although it's been a little further behind than radiology, but it's definitely coming. And I've seen demonstrations of the tools that can, look at nuclear morphology and can count mitotic figures and help assess malignancy. And so I think, image analysis is well suited for AI. The problem is having, the good data on which to train with the proper clinical annotation and removing all the artifacts from the data set. So it's not a trivial problem, but it's, I think, a real opportunity for patient care.
And then
Thank you
also
so much.
but then it's more than that, right? Because then it's also layering it into the overall patient assessment, and how does that layer into multidisciplinary clinic assessment of what the care plan is going to be for that patient? So it's just, to underscore Dr. Sharpless's point, illustrates the need for there to be research of these assessments going on in parallel to current clinical care plans.
Yeah, if I could make one other point about that, by the way, we don't find AI interpretation of radiology and pathology slides that scary for the most part, but I do find AI interpretation of electronic health records a little scary, because there you're starting to allocate resources of care based on an AI interpretation of a patient document. And so that has immense potential for privacy and de-identification concerns, but I think it also has the potential to enforce social inequities. So if you direct care based on latent variables hidden in the AI data set without really understanding what's driving those care decisions, then AI has the potential to kind of reinforce some bad mistakes that we may make in our way that we assess patients and provide for future care. So I think we have to be really deliberate about this and understand the potentials for AI to worsen something like cancer disparities, in addition to them being a really transformative and exciting tool.
Ted, any thoughts from the community on use of AI and the challenges and opportunities there?
I mean, I think that I think that from the level in terms of what Dr. Sharpless talked about, I think it's not something down the road, it's something now. I think one of the biggest concerns, to sort of echo what Dr. Sharpless said at the end, is that you have really the downside when you start applying AI against the EHR and you're basically trying to make a diagnosis a la Watson. You run into a lot of issues, and I think you can propagate the very health disparities that are sort of, everybody's worked up now from a good standpoint about health disparities and tackling health disparities. I think you can make that even worse. You're just not going to substitute the idea of having some machine substitute for an oncologist who is literally touching, feeling the patient, seeing the patient, and knowing all of the other the impacts of the variables going into that diagnosis. I think AI can be sort of a wonderful tool as you have more variables of diagnostic tests, more variables of therapies, and more complications in terms of treating. But I think at the end of the day, we've got to be very careful that there's not going to be some robotic doctor who's going to be diagnosing and treating the patient. And Jim, let me just say one other thing. Let me do the political thing of sort of giving you an answer to a question that you didn't ask, but I want to go back to this idea of the shortfalls that we're seeing right now in COVID, and some of the remarks that Karen made, is I want to say that we launched a campaign called Time to Screen that will really go into high gear in July. In fact, our spokesperson is Patty LaBelle. She just did a wonderful job recording some radio spots as well as some video spots in terms of a large PSA campaign. And we're not only trying to direct this at COVID, but in general, because I think as Karen mentioned, I mean, if you look at pre-COVID, there were many, we're seeing that in this breast cancer study, you're kind of taken aback by seeing basically the shortfalls in screening and the compliance with screening. So we have a lot of work to do, because all of the good things that are happening in terms of the Moonshot, from diagnosis to treatment, won't go anywhere if people don't get screened properly.
Barriers to screening is a major research question, right? Understanding those in different demographics is really important, and in different geographies. And sometimes it has to do with the way the health system does business. You know, we found at my previous organization, when we opened up mammography on nights and weekends, uptake was spectacular, right? Because you were making it easy for the patient to get there. So I think, you know, many of the cancer centers are thinking about different ways they can work with primary care to make screening more accessible. But as you start to go down the care equity path, things that are just basic, like lack of transportation, is a major reason why people actually don't get to cancer screening. So there are a lot of things that we can do organizationally, but in working together with health systems to try to reduce those barriers, to Ted's point. And I think that's, it's a research question, but it's also a cancer care delivery question, or healthcare delivery question, that we need to tackle if we're going to make a dent on this screening compliance number.
And just to add to that, and then I'll stop, because this is just so fascinating. We need to do a better job of understanding from the patient and the individual level of what are some of those barriers. I totally agree with Karen in terms of transportation is such a basic thing, but yet it's one of the big impediments to screening. But I'll tell you a case. So Dr. Barbara McEnany, who's on the COA board, is the former president of the AMA, was telling a story that in New Mexico, because of the outlie rural areas, the Navajo Nation and all that, that someone got the bright idea, which on the surface it seems great, is we'll take the screening, we'll take the breast cancer screening basically to the patient. So we'll take a van, we'll put the screening, we'll be able to do the mammograms in the van. And you know what the problem is? The problem is that no one showed up, because the word got out. If you go into that van, you will come out with cancer. Because the whole idea is, some people went in, were diagnosed, they had cancer, but the belief was you go in, you have cancer. So the problem too is we always have to go to the individual, to the patient, and understand what some of the barriers are there from their perspective, not what just we all think are the barriers.
And we go back to the ARPA-H and an NCI description, or what ACS does. You know, there is a whole component we haven't talked about here, and that's population health research, which includes healthcare delivery research. And that is exactly focused on what are the barriers to screening, what are the barriers to care. We've identified the guidelines. Why don't people do it, and how can we help them? Same with tobacco cessation and these kinds of programs, funded strongly by the NCI from a cancer prevention perspective, funded by ACS and funded by other organizations, because that's a critical gap in us closing the situation so that patients are diagnosed earlier and given the appropriate treatment.
If I might say a word about the cancer screening post-pandemic thing, I think I agree with everything that's been said. It's a disaster. I mean, the declines, 90% decline in mammography and pap smears, and and recovering from this is going to be a real challenge that we all of those of us interested in cancer care should embrace and take collective action for. But it's going to be a long haul. I mean, we think there are 10 million screening events missed in the United States, of that order when you add everything up. But two other points to make about that. One is that I'm glad Karen mentioned lung cancer screening. This is something that's worried the NCI for a while. The uptake of that technology is minuscule. The benefit is potentially quite large. The USPSTF has recently revised their recommendations to make it an even larger population to benefit from screening. And we've done some modeling if the impact of that were adopted more broadly. The effect on cancer mortality could be quite significant. So I'm mystified as to why there isn't better uptake of this. I know it has something to do with CMS coverage and shared decision making and yada, yada, yada. But basically, doctors have to talk to their patients about this if they're eligible, because not doing that and then having your patient die of lung cancer is a really bad outcome. We need to get more serious about this. The other point I'd like to make about the pandemic is that most cancers in the United States are not diagnosed by cancer screening. They're diagnosed by symptomatic evaluation. And those were way down too during the pandemic. So not only did we see a huge deficit of screen detected cancers, but we saw a deficit of symptom presenting cancers or non-screen detected cancers. And that has to do with clinics being closed and patients not wanting to go see their doctors and lots of things. But that's also going to be a huge problem, is that these patients are still presumably going to present with cancer at later stage when they're less easy to treat. And so we really have to prepare for this sort of new public health problem created by the pandemic of later stage cancer, as Ted mentioned earlier. And so I think that getting the word out about that and making sure patients do what they can to make up this missed care should be job number one for all of us coming out of the pandemic.
Thanks. And we've nibbled around the edges a little bit, and I think alluded to it, but it seems like there's likely healthcare disparities in screening, prevention, diagnosis, treatment, all across the board. And then I was wondering if any of you might offer some examples of specific areas where you're seeing healthcare disparities in any of those things related to cancer that ought to be addressed.
It's throughout, Jim, and it starts at the clinical trial piece of it. We design trials and we basically test clinical trials in a lot of people that look more like me than the rest of the population. And I think it stems from that standpoint. I think it goes through diagnosis and it goes through treatment. I think if you can talk about good things coming out of the pandemic and COVID-19 in general, I think one of the good things is everybody's now talking about health disparities. I just hope that we don't continue talking about it, but we do some things. I know at COA, the board, we had a big 2-hour discussion on this last week, and we have a task force on it. We're doing some things in the health disparity realm right now. Our current president, Dr. Kasia Patel, it is his top priority. But I think, Jim, we see it throughout. I mean, clinical trials, diagnosis, treatment, health disparities. We need to think about this very differently, starting from the clinical trial perspective.
Yeah, we actually through ACS and ACS CAN actually developed a health cancer care equity scorecard with 17 different criteria, and this is in collaboration actually with NCCN to talk about ways that can be easily implemented across different types of service providers, large cancer centers to community practices. What can they do to talk about training for employees? Ted talked about clinical trials. We know that patients of all demographics want to participate in clinical trials. There's a disparity sometimes in them being asked based on presumptions. So that requires some awareness and some training. So that's one. Making sure that you have culturally and linguistically representative patient navigators, key for the cancer care continuum, right? We know patients who are navigated generally do better and have a lower cost of care. Really important things to do. So things that can be implemented. We already talked about flexible hours for screening and treatment appointments. These are the kinds of things that live on that equity scorecard that we're trying to disseminate across different practices with the hope that we can give simple, easy to achieve, implementable action items to help close that gap in cancer care equity.
And, Dr. Sharpless, I don't want to miss you, because the fourth pillar of the cancer moonshot was elimination of disparities, and I was wondering if you might offer a few words about what the cancer moonshot could do about disparities.
Yeah, it's as I said, the health disparities is sort of baked into throughout the moonshot, so we expect everything the moonshot does to have to take this on, and that's sort of a general paradigm for the NCI in general. Is we want to think about every discovery in terms of not only what does that discovery mean for patients, but what does that discovery mean for every patient? How do we disseminate those advances so that all benefit. I mean, there's some good news and some bad news. I mean, the good news is that I think the community's really bought into cancer health disparities research. Our annual budget now is for disparities research is on the order of $500 million. We've seen a massive influx in interest, lots of new grant applications, lots of great ideas. We've also seen some improvement in some disparities. For example, the difference between mortality and, say, African-American patients and white patients is still too large. African American patients have a higher cancer mortality than white patients in the United States, but it's narrowing. It's been getting headed in the right direction, and similarly for other racial and ethnic disparities. So there has been some improvement, and there has been a big commitment to this topic, but there's still a lot of challenges. I think we all have the experience of seeing a great new technology or a great new idea for prevention or screening or treatment, and then it can't it works at the tertiary care cancer palace, but it doesn't work out in the community. And how to disseminate those findings so that all patients can benefit from our progress is really important. A disparity that we've been watching with some interest over the recent few years has been the difference in rural versus urban patients. So we see, as I mentioned, whereas racial disparities are narrowing, the rural-urban split is not. It's actually enlarging for reasons we don't understand. So in the early 1990s, rural patients with cancer actually did better in the United States than urban patients, but that has not been, but that's been headed in the wrong direction for ever since, for the last 3 decades. And rurality is a complicated thing. It's confounded by socioeconomic status, level of education, access to care, race, many, many other things. And so studying it has been hard, but that is a disparity that I think we got to figure out, because if we have these advances, but we can't make them work for all our patients, no matter where they live in the United States or what their access is to care, then we're not making the kind of progress that I think we all aspire to.
Thank you. And then we're getting close to time to wrap up. So I wanted to have give each of you time for a final thought. But also in that final thought, cancer is a scary diagnosis. We've all, known people or had it and been touched by it in some way. There must be some good news in all the progress we made. So if you can try to finish up your remarks with what's the good news we should take away from this about advances in cancer research, diagnosis, and treatment. And let's start with Ted and then finish with Dr. Sharpless.
I go back to what I said when I started. I mean, the good news is, Dr. Sharpless said it. there's sort of a golden age now. And if you look at it, start with, Scott Hamilton, Lance Armstrong, testicular cancer, curative, basically, and you look at other cancers that we've moved from basically treatment to curative. You look at other cancers that basically when you get cancer, it's not necessarily a death sentence as it was before. I had a grandfather who died of leukemia, that his type of leukemia, if it were now and he were diagnosed and treated, he would have lived, he wouldn't have died. So the idea that when you hear those 3 terrible little words, you have cancer, the fact of the matter is there's so much in terms of what can be done. And all that. My wife was a oncology nurse for 10 years, recently retired. And basically, you hear some of the dramatic stories with some of the new IO drugs. And you look at it. So there is so much to be positive about, but we've got to keep in mind between that and the reality of the world, or you asked the question, Jim, about boots on the ground. There are a lot of problems. There are middlemen and other interests that basically get in the way of patients getting optimally diagnosed and treated.
Dr. Knudsen.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that was said. It is clear that we are making progress. If for no other measurable outcome, then cancer mortality is declining. So that's a win. There's only one way to look at it. Unfortunately, not everyone is benefiting equally. And we talked a lot about the different touch points today in terms of delivering equitable cancer prevention and cancer care. And I think all of us on this call are really dedicated toward that. I think we also see these great things on the horizon based on basic and population and clinical research being funded through the federal government and through agencies like ACS. So, we talked about the promise of the Genome Project and unlocking those into new therapeutics, and increasing usage of targeted therapy is coming, smarter drugs coming that are really truly targeting the tumor microenvironment, new strategies for earlier detection through liquid biopsy, so non-invasive, low cost, easy to deliver, but we still need to do the research to understand how to implement that. So I think there's progress that's been made. There's foundational research that's about to leap into the translational space. But the final good news that I would say, which is at some level made a lot of this possible, is that cancer is a bipartisan problem and has been accepted as such. And that there has been a groundswell of support from across all stakeholders in the country to really focus on this incredibly important issue for our nation. And so for that, I am very thankful.
Thank you. Dr. Sharpless, you get the last word.
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I think we've talked a bit about the problems, and there are some real problems. We talked about drug pricing and cancer health disparities and access to care and recovering from the pandemic and all that means. And, so I think there are some significant problems. We're very worried about these problems, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is a good time for cancer research. In fact, a golden age for cancer research and cancer care, because these decades of scientific investigation and both commitment to basic science and population science research has led to an understanding of cancer where now we have a lot of great ideas, and we have better ways to prevent cancer, better ways to diagnose cancer, better ways to treat cancer. In some cases, we have so many effective therapies that figuring out how to use them together and how to combine them is our major problem. Sequencing therapies in lung cancer is now a major issue. That was not a problem when I started out in oncology 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I think it's a good time. And on top of that trajectory of declining mortality and advances, we now have some new stuff. We have an administration that has made progress against cancer a top domestic priority. So President Biden has said he would like to end cancer as we know it for all Americans. We're emerging from this pandemic, which has this sort of silver lining, if you will, that the country really believes in the power of biomedical research now. And the use of monies for cancer research and other basic biomedical investigation is seen as a very good use of federal funds, and has created this strong bipartisan support for something like the NCI that Kieran mentioned. And then we have this, really great scientific opportunity with this understanding of cancer. Now translate that with the help of industry and with the help of academia and government all working together to really advance progress for our patients as quickly as possible and drive cancer mortality down at an even faster rate. It's been declining, but I think the rate of decline can be further accelerated. And so I predict this will be a good time for cancer research as we get past the problems that we spoke about at length.
Thank you to all three of our speakers. If we were in the live auditorium like we used to be, you'd hear a round of applause, but you'll just have to take my word for it that you're getting that. I really appreciate your time. We've recorded the panel, and we're gonna, after we edit it a bit and smooth it out, we're gonna post it online for those people that weren't able to join today, and we'll send it out. And then a couple of articles were mentioned today by Dr. Sharpless and the Time to Screen initiative. And Dr. Knudsen, if you have anything that you'd like us to send out, we're going to send a follow-up note out once we have the link to the replay ready, and we'll attach those articles so they reach a broader audience and they hear about your initiatives. So we're happy to do that, and we really appreciate you taking the time today. And then last thing is Applied Policy helps organizations, manufacturers of drugs and diagnostics and others improve the lives of people suffering from cancer and other conditions. And we are hiring. We have the job announcements posted on our website, but we're always looking for talent. So if you know of anybody, please let them know about Applied Policy and that we are hiring. So it's a selfless plug, but thanks to Applied Policy team. And we look forward to keeping in touch with each of you. So thank you very much again for joining. And we'll have an announcement of our speakers next month shortly after they finish accepting. So thank you all and have a great day.